Okay, everybody. Today we're going to get the ball rolling on Mexico's independence. We're going to backtrack a little bit and we're going to get at the roots of independence. But by the end of this, we're going to be at the actual Mexican independence. We're going to have Mexico completely liberated from Spain. So there will be no quote unquote New Spain, no empire of New Spain, no viceroyalty of New Spain, none of that. We will have a fully independent Mexico by the end of this lecture. Now, as I mentioned, before we get there, we're going to have to backtrack a little bit because we do have to see, in terms of the roots of Mexican independence, we've got to look at what's going on in Spain itself, because what's happening in Spain is going to be, I'm not going to say equally important as the independence movements within Mexico, but it is critical. We have to understand what's going on in Spain as well, because what's going on in Spain is going to contribute to their weakness in quote unquote New Spain, in the viceroyalty. So what we're going to start off with today is we're going to start off with a geopolitical idea that's going to be a huge problem for Spain. And that's the idea of the balance of power. Balance of power politics is something that European nations are going to be dealing with from the beginning of the mid to late 1600s. And this is going to be a problem all the way out through World War I. Okay, so balance of power is really a tough problem for them. And you can see on the screen, we've got a map of Europe here. The question, what balance of power politics is, at its simplest, it's checking the power of other nations, making sure that one nation does not become more powerful at the expense of other nations. So France can become more powerful if they want to go out and do things that causes expansion or gives them greater wealth, whatever. They can do that as long as England and Spain look at things and go, okay, we're not falling too far behind France. France isn't getting too powerful. Now, kingship in Spain is a perfect example of the problems of this issue, and it's going to spawn a war in Europe. And this war that's going to deal with this is actually called the War of Spanish Succession. Now, the whole war was seemingly unavoidable in that Charles II, the guy pictured on the screen, ascended to the throne at the age of 4 in 1665. He was sickly literally his entire life. He was never really a particularly vital human. Vital, when I say vital, I mean he didn't possess vitality. He was constantly ill. He was sterile, probably due to the insane amount of inbreeding within the Habsburg line. The Habsburgs were one of the important royal families of Europe, and they were constantly intermarrying, and Charles II was likely sterile because of that. And as a result, Charles II died without children in 1700. So he ascended to the throne at 4 and had a much longer reign than anybody could have predicted for him, but no male heir. Now, virtually everybody knew that this was a possibility. Everybody knew that there was a very good chance he could die without an heir, and European nations began preparing for this while Charles was still alive. In part, they start preparing for this because no one wanted another country to benefit from whoever the new king might actually be. What all of these nations allegedly claimed they wanted was a transition of power from Charles II to whomever. They want a transition of power that will assure that Spain, France, and England are going to remain equal, or at least relatively equal, in terms of power. I'll come back to that, to those plans in a second. Now, Spain's laws allowed for a male to pass titles, and I will fix I'll fix the pictures here when I upload them. Spain's laws allowed for a male to pass titles to a male heir via their mothers. So Charles II, even though he dies without children, it's possible that he could pass down his titles through his mother's line. He was related, Charles II was. He was related via marriage to the Bourbons. This was another royal family in Europe. The Bourbons of France. Charles II's half-sister had married Louis XIV of France. And their grandson, Philip, was a possible heir. The grandson of Louis XIV, Philip, was a possible heir to the throne of Spain. His other sister was Charles II's other sister was married to the Holy Roman Emperor, a guy named Leopold I. So, see how this plays out in terms of the balance of power standpoint? Spain is at this point, one of the true European powers. They are still unquestionably a power along with England and France. If Charles II dies, which he did, and the Spanish crown goes to Philip, then essentially the French and the Spanish kingdoms are combined. They are not literally combined. I don't want to give you the wrong impression about this. I don't want you thinking that France and Spain are two entities and they become one, but they're united by marriage. So they are going to be a very big force. So Spain's loss of Charles II, if Philip becomes the king, France benefits from this unquestionably. And if the crown of Spain goes to Leopold I, then you've got Spain kind of in the fold of the Holy Roman Empire, and the Holy Roman Empire and the various Germanic kingdoms, they also benefit from all of this. I want to mention here that Leopold I was absolutely hoping that this would happen because the Holy Roman Empire, I know this isn't a European history class, but I do want to mention this. The Holy Roman Empire had at one point been the big power in Europe. They were literally the successor to Rome in Europe. But by the time we're in the 1600s and the early 1700s, nobody cares about the Holy Roman Empire. Leopold I is thinking, if I can get a hold of the crown of Spain, this will catapult the Holy Roman Empire into kind of meaning something again. Now, to try to stop all of this, I want to mention, let me stop for a second here. Remember, the grandson of Louis XIV is Philip of Anjou, this guy pictured in the center of the screen. So he's the Philip I keep mentioning here. Now, to try to stop all of this, England, which as they see it, we become weaker no matter who becomes the king of Spain, they signed an agreement to support the Bourbon claim. This would be Louis XIV, and Philip of Anjou. They had signed an agreement that supported the Bourbon claim, and this is just a kind of convoluted picture of the European royal families. I don't want you to, you're not going to get tested on this, but you can just see through this sort of chart here how convoluted all of this stuff and how interrelated everybody is. But England had signed this treaty, the Treaty of Dover, in 1670 to back the Bourbon claims. So as England sees it, even though we are going to lose out one way or the other, we're willing to make peace with the Bourbons to kind of preserve some bit of status. So they're much happier, as they see it, with Philip becoming the king of Spain. Now, 3 years later, after the death of Charles II Stuart in England, they signed another agreement in 1688 with the Dutch and with Leopold now to back the Holy Roman Empire's claim to Spain. So England, depending on who's in charge, is playing it both ways. Now, adding to the intrigue, I guess, if you want to put it this way, when the Grand Alliance of 1688 is created, the King of England, the guy who succeeded Charles II Stuart, was Charles II Habsburg. There's a reason I'm mentioning these last names. Charles II Habsburg was a Habsburg, just like Leopold I. So as he saw it, having the Holy Roman Empire strengthened would somewhat strengthen English power during this period. Now, courtesy of a whole new round of marriages in October of 1700, when Charles II was on his deathbed, Charles II Habsburg, sorry, when he dies, Leopold's claim went to his sons Joseph, and if he declined, the Archduke Charles. In France, in the meantime, Louis XVI was working to make sure Philip of Anjou got the throne. He's doing all sorts of things to ensure that this is going to happen. Now, what is of real importance here is that while Louis XVI is doing all of this stuff, Charles II Habsburg is doing all of this stuff in England. There's intrigue with Leopold. There's intrigue with France. Nobody bothered to see what Charles II of Spain actually wanted. Nobody asked him if he'd like to weigh in. And when he did, he decided that he was going to will his throne to Philip of Anjou. Remember, the grandson of Louis XVI. So this war breaks out, and it pretty much winds up in a massive world war. And when I say world war, it's not, you can't really call it a world war because it's not fought literally everywhere across the world, but it's fought all across Europe with the bulk of the powers of Europe involved in all of this stuff. And it does actually carry over a little bit into North and South America, which is why some historians actually call it a world war. And I've got on here World War X because it's too hard to number world wars. When we think of world war in history classes, most of the time we talk about World War I and World War II. But virtually any historian, whether they're an American historian, whether they're a European historian, whether they do Pacific history, whatever, they're going to tell you that there have been things that qualify as, quote, world wars, dating all the way back to the Peloponnesian era in Greek history. So the term World War and World War I, World War II, it's largely meaningless. But this is a world war by virtually every standard here. So this breaks out. This world war breaks out. It involved, 11 different nations in Europe, some of which actually fought on both sides at various times, including Spain. Spain wound up having people who fought on both sides during this war. So 11 different countries. Total casualties on all sides amounted to about 1.2 million, and the war ended with the Bourbon claim of Philip of Anjou ascending to the throne. Now, this is important. Philip II was the person that Charles II of Spain wanted on the throne in the first place. It's who he willed Spain's throne to. It's who France wanted on the throne. Louis XIV, sorry, I keep saying Louis XVI for some reason. Louis XIV, remember, wanted Philip on the throne. Philip of Anjou is king of Spain. Louis XIV is king of France. You've got Bourbons on both of those thrones. And while they are not literally uniting Spain and France, again, it does make for a very powerful alliance. France and Spain together is a very powerful alliance. Now, after all of that is done, the big question is, who cares? What difference does all of this make? Well, Spain actually cares about this. This is going to be Spain's kind of last real moment in power, particularly in the New World, because things are going to start to collapse for Spain in very short order and all of that. But we'll get to that. Right now, with Spain and France allied, there is no more real threat of a French incursion into New Spain. If you remember when we talked about the point of why there was settlement in Texas, what Spain was doing by going up the Mississippi River and engaging in exploration and all of that. The whole point is to stop the French. And now with this alliance with Philip of Anjou on the throne in Spain, they don't need to worry about that. France is not going to invade Spanish territory anymore, in particular, New Spain. So that's all well and good. And this whole idea gets cemented in 1762. And let me make sure. Nope, I don't have that. In 1762, when France actually cedes the entirety of the Louisiana territory to Spain, largely because France is at war with England at this particular moment, and they fear losing the Mississippi River and all of the area that makes up, quote unquote, the Louisiana territory. They fear losing that to England. So France figures, let's give it to Spain because we're related not only by Catholicism, we're related by blood. At least it's not in the hands of England. Now, I want to make a very quick point here. I'm going to have to draw on the screen again. When we think of Louisiana today, we think of just here. But remember, during this era, the Louisiana Territory, it's named after King Louis IX. Louisiana extended all the way up here into present-day Canada. So this is a massive amount of territory. But the big issue, the most important issue for all of these countries is that the eastern boundary of Louisiana is the Mississippi River. So whoever controls Louisiana controls the Mississippi River. It is really actually pretty much that simple. So everybody wants Louisiana. So Spain gets it because of all of this stuff. And now it's in this era that Philip's own son, Charles III, or Carlos III, as he preferred his name to be styled, he becomes the king of Spain now. And Carlos III actually begins to embark on a series of reforms. Now, with passing the throne from Philip to Carlos III, there's no debate, there's no fighting going on because Carlos III is the actual son of Philip. So everybody's fine with that. Carlos III was a fan of a philosophical movement that's occurring during this era called the Enlightenment. Okay, and he was guided by Enlightenment era philosophies. Now, as he does this, one of the things that's important about the Enlightenment era is that it spurs reform movements all across the Western world. And Carlos III is no exception. He engages in a series of reform movements. Now, the goal of Carlos's reform plan is to make the administration of the American colonies, New Spain, easier. So remember, when we're talking about American colonies, get out of the quote-unquote United States history mindset. We're not talking about the 13. Okay, the American colonies in this context refers to New Spain and all of Spain's territories in the quote-unquote New World. So his plan, as part of this series of reform, is to make the administration of New Spain easier and hopefully in the process restore the prestige that Spain had enjoyed all of these years before. Carlos winds up sending one of his aides, a man named Jose Galvez, to Mexico, and he sends him on this fact-finding mission to Mexico. And Galvez is on tour, essentially, throughout New Spain from 1765 to 1771. And this tour is going to lead to some big changes within Mexico. And these changes are known as the Bourbon Reforms. Now, first thing that the government, that the crown is going to do, Carlos is going to do this on Galvez's recommendation. First thing they're going to do is they are going to replace Mexican lower level administrators, the local administrators in New Spain. They're going to replace all of those people with Spanish officers. Now, the thought that Galvez conveys to Carlos, and Carlos agrees, is that Spanish officers will be more trustworthy and thus more efficient. They know what Spain wants. They're going to carry out traditional Spain's policies, but the emphasis here is on Spain. Okay, everything's going to make it easier for Spain. Carlos is also going to engage in a popular move, but one that has a backlash, an unintended consequence. Carlos is going to lower taxes, which everybody looked at and said, oh my God, this is going to create a revenue problem. We're going to have much lower revenues going forward. But Carlos also claims that the rationalization will help here, because by replacing all of those authorities with Spanish authorities as opposed to local peoples, it's going to mean more efficient tax collection, which means we're going to actually collect more of the taxes that are owed. So the actual rate will go down, but the revenue will go up because we're actually going out and getting the taxes. And going out and getting the taxes was something that you can probably figure out locals did not like. They understood that if there aren't tax collectors who are coming to get the taxes, it doesn't matter what the tax rate is. Okay, so they don't like this. They're not happy about all of this stuff. Another huge change for New Spain / what's about to become Mexico is that Carlos also lowered tariffs throughout New Spain's ports, and also started adopting some measures of free trade within Spain's empire. Now, following Galvez and following the implementation of these so-called Bourbon reforms, Carlos sends another of his advisors, a man named Marquis de Rubí, and Rubí is tasked with, Carlos doesn't care about what Rubí's ideas about the economy are. Rubí is there strictly to take a look at improving and inspecting the military organization of the frontier. Galvez's job was to figure out the economic stuff. Rubí is going to be about the military stuff. Rubí also is going to go on a fact-finding mission. He's going to come in 1766 and 1767, gathering intelligence. He is going to go on his own tour of the empire. And you can see on this bottom picture on the screen here, this tour is a huge endeavor that takes Rubí from East Texas. He's going to get in the Rio Grande, via the Rio Grande at a place called San Juan Bautista. And he's going to swing into California. He's going to go as far north as Santa Fe. He's going to go as far south as right into the Yucatan, right down by the Yucatan Peninsula. So he is all over New Spain. And then he's going to come back and he's going to recommend and ultimately implement a new Presidio system. Among this Bourbon reform that happens is Marquis de Rubí's recommendation of something adopted in 1772 called the New Regulation of Presidios. The New Regulation of Presidios. Now, the first point in the New Regulation of the Presidios was that the threat from European enemies had been greatly diminished by 1762. Because of that, because the threat had been greatly diminished, Rubí recommended and Carlos implemented that Spain would pull back their missionary and their military presence in East Texas. So Texas is going to be the primary, I don't want to call it the beneficiary, but they're going to be the primary beneficiary of these changes. This is going to lead, this new regulation of the Presidios is going to lead to a mass relocation of settlers from East Texas to San Antonio in order specifically to strengthen San Antonio. The next thing that's going to happen is that the new regulation is going to move the capital, or excuse me, the provincial capital of Texas to Bexar, which is how the Spanish pronounced it, Bexar. Various people today refer to it as Behar or Bexar. If you're a Yankee coming down here, it's Bexar. But either way, for the Spanish, it was Bexar. Indian policy is also going to see a major change. Rabi recommended what he referred to as, quote, a velvet glove policy, especially with regard to Indians in Texas. The velvet glove policy toward the Comanche and Northern Indians in Texas was a clear, unyielding iron, for them, it's a velvet glove, meaning that, we'll trade with you, we'll give you inducements, and we'll just kind of adopt a live and let live policy with the Comanche and the Northern Indians. However, for the Apache further to the west, sorry about my voice cracking there, to the Apache further to the west, unyielding, iron-fisted approach toward the Apaches. Rabi's understanding of events might have been a little bit skewed. He believed that Comanche Norteño attacks were not about the Spanish, that they didn't care about the Spanish, but rather that the Spanish believed that, but that the Comanche believed that the Spanish were coddling the Apache via missionizing. So his thought was, let's create this alliance with the Norteños, the Northern Indians, and Spain and the Comanche could solve a common problem, the Apaches. That's why he referred to it as a velvet glove. We're not, we're still in charge, but we're not going to fight you guys. We're going to fight the common enemy. Now, Rabi's policy in the West caused very little upheaval. And actually, most of the Spanish colonists in the West supported Rabi's reforms. East Texas colonists, though, were far less happy about this. The East Texas pobladores, these are the common, average, everyday people, people who lived around the presidios and lived around the mission complexes, especially in places where they're moving towards San Antonio. Approximately 500 or so of these had enjoyed a relative prosperity, and they really didn't have an interest in moving toward San Antonio. And in particular, there was a group that was referred to as pobladores. These were a mixture of Spanish, Black, Native Americans, some French peoples. They rejected. They said, we do not want to move. We beg you. They begged the governor of Texas at the time, a guy named Juan Maria de Ripperda. They said, please do not make us move. Now, Ripperda was sympathetic about all of this stuff, but he was also unmoved. He essentially took the position that, hey, I understand, I get why you don't want to move. You've had this relative prosperity, so I get it. But I also have orders, so everybody get your stuff together. We're moving. Now, this move starts in June of 1773. 167 families, plus a number of soldiers and friars, left East Texas marching toward San Antonio. It took 3 months for them to get to San Antonio. It was an incredibly brutal march because of poor weather conditions. There was flooding. A lot of people made the move on foot because of a lack of horses. They finally made it, though. They finally made it there. However, almost as soon as they got there, 30 of the people who were migrating just died almost immediately because of the poorness of the conditions. Not surprisingly, after these people regained their health, after some of the conditions improved, and they kind of got their bearings together and regrouped, they started lobbying Ripperda to allow them to return all the way, to go back home, to go back where they actually started. Now, he told them that, I'm not going to let you do that. He came up with a halfway sort of compromise. He said, I can't let you go all the way back to where we started. However, I'm going to personally approve you to go as far east as the Trinity River. And the settlers accepted this. The main fruit of their march back was that in 1779, 500 settlers from all across East Texas arrived at and settled near an old mission. This old mission was called the Nuestra Senora de Guadalupe de los Nacogdoches, and they founded a new town, Nacogdoches. Now, Galvez, the aforementioned Galvez, who I haven't talked about in a couple of minutes here, Galvez, as Carlos's main advisor to New Spain, also created a new title in 1776. It's an important date for U.S. history. It's an important date for Mexican history as well. Galvez creates a new title called the Minister General of the Indies for Spain. Now, this is an administrative entity. The Minister General of the Indies is an administrative entity that stretched across the present-day northern Mexican states, as well as the present-day U.S. states of Texas, New Mexico, and California. So essentially, this the Minister General of the Indies is going to have control over the northern parts of Mexico. Now, this is a command general military position. So it's going to be headed by a military officer, and essentially they're going to have the rank of general in all of this stuff. This Minister General is also answerable to the king, only to the king. Now, that causes a little bit of friction here because this Minister General is essentially, for the northern territories, at the same rank as the Viceroy of New Spain, but he's also over all of the governors by virtue of the title and by virtue of this person being a military officer. He's over all of the governors of these territories, and this is where Texas plays a role in all of this stuff. The Minister General is going to be a guy named Teodoro de Croix, and he absolutely, entirely agreed with Rubi and planned to go after the Apache. But European affairs ended up blowing the whole thing up again before there could be real crisis between de Croix and the governor of Texas. When European affairs ended up blowing up again, this blew up the entire administration that was created by Carlos III, that was created by Galvez, all of these people. It's all going to be blown up. De Croix is going to lose the ability to raise a force large enough to actually fight the Apache, because even though he wants to go after the Apache, when all of this stuff falls apart in Europe, the governor of Texas basically tells him, forget it, I'm not helping you. And de Croix is only able to get as many troops as he can actually bribe in all of this, which isn't really that many. Now, as far as what's going on in Europe that blows all of this stuff up, I know that's the question on all of your minds. The simple answer is new king again, new plan. Carlos III died, and he's succeeded by his son, Carlos IV, pictured again on the screen. Now, Carlos IV was certainly not his father. He was not as big a philosopher as his father was. So, as far as thinking about the Enlightenment era philosophies, he was kind of like, who cares? But one historian referred to Carlos IV in the following manner. He said about him, quote, Carlos IV was lacking in wisdom and political affairs, or lacking in wisdom in political affairs on the European continent, which is a nice way of saying he had no idea what was going on, nor how to fix what was going on. Carlos IV's activities really caused the decline of the Spanish Empire, starting with Spain's involvement in the American Revolution and the French Revolution of 1789. His understanding of things, his participation was so scattered that over the course of all of this stuff, Spain wound up at war with both England and France at various points until the early 1800s. And more importantly, this created a distraction in Spain that diverted attention and money from New Spain. So this is how it plays into all of this. Now, when I say the Enlightenment started it, what I mean by this is that those beliefs that Carlos III had, they started the spiral by focusing on secularization. Okay, this focus on secularization meant a decline in the importance of the missions and a problem with the Franciscans, who had always enjoyed a fair amount of power in New Spain. Enlightenment philosophy undermined the work of the missionaries. Plus, on top of this, the Franciscans were under attack from an economic standpoint as well. Those pobladores that I mentioned, particularly in places like Texas, but also in California, they depended on steady marketable goods. And the pobladores, especially in Texas and California, relied on livestock ranching and preferred livestock ranching to growing crops. So this is a bigger problem in Texas than it is in California, but it's still a little bit of a problem in California. As the pobladores saw it, the Franciscan-owned cattle ranches, this was competition to them, and it was competition that the pobladores could not afford. So they didn't like this stuff. Local governments, meanwhile, saw the mission land as something that could be taxed. Now, before the secularization, the moving things away from religious orientations, before secularization, the idea of going after mission lands and privatizing it and taxing it was out of the question. Nobody would have even proposed doing such a thing. But once Carlos III is pushing for secularization, that sort of mindset does actually trickle down, and people in parts of New Spain start saying, let's do it. Let's take these lands, let's tax them, and the like. Now, the missions also had an enemy with the Native Americans. Mission life, as we detailed in a previous lecture, was marked by cruelty. It was marked by dehumanization. It was marked by intimidation. And this wasn't just kind of the perception of the Native Americans. This was a fact of life. Add to it that there was very little in the way of sanitation at missions. There was a constant buildup of trash and human waste, so much so that cholera and influenza were common killers at missions all across New Spain. So Indians grew to despise life at the missions and rebelled, sometimes in covert ways like feigning illnesses, showing up late to work, sabotaging tools, things like that. Others pretended to comply with Christianity on its face, while and then did things like practiced their traditional religions behind closed doors, while others overtly resisted what the missions were doing. They engaged in self-sabotaging behaviors like gambling, alcohol consumption. These two things were rampant amongst these Native American communities that were associated with the missions. Now, since the military posts were largely understaffed and facing Indians like the Comanche and the Wichita, who were trading horses for guns and growing in power during these eras, many settlers saw the Presidios as well as basically being useless. They said, we don't see any benefit in the Presidios. As conflicts in Europe got worse and got worse and got worse, and supply shortages started happening, weapons shortages started happening, money shortages started happening, the Presidios had real problems. They had no money to pay soldiers, for example. They got so bad, conditions at the Presidios got so bad that not only were the people in the surrounding areas disinterested, the soldiers themselves became disinterested in all of the stuff about the missions. Once the Crown's policy of essentially bribing the Apache became known, pretty much all of the Indians in the region wanted the same consideration, and this led to massive amounts of power shifting. The power on the frontier began to shift away from the missions and obviously away from the Presidios and thus from the control of New Spain, began shifting to the Comanche and the frontier traders. Now, as the Comanche saw it, they could come into these areas, they could take all of the livestock they could handle. And when I say take, they could take all of the livestock they could handle. The pobladores did not like this, but the pobladores also had to reflect on this, and they concluded there's nothing we can do to stop them. We're just out of luck on all of this. So they started trading. The pobladores started trying to trade because they knew that the Comanches were trading with Americans on the frontier. And trading with Americans on the frontier greatly empowered the Comanche. And the Comanche started seeing the Americans. This is kind of the height of irony on some level, but they start seeing the Americans as their real allies in the region. The Comanche will ultimately, obviously, realize that the Americans are not their allies. But this is how they see it in the late 1700s. American traders at this point were willingly giving the Comanche functional weapons, and they were giving them goods that Native Americans and Native American leaders saw as status worthy. So the Comanche basically said, you know what? Let the Apache have the Spanish. Do whatever you want with the Spanish. We don't even care. We're not worried about the Spanish because we've got this new ally in the Americans. Now, Texans continued to migrate out of San Antonio, establishing places like Goliad, establishing places like Salcedo, San Marcos de Neve. Trade continued to go on, but there were all sorts of problems. People in Nacogdoches, for example, violated trade regulations. They traded with people in Louisiana, even though, according to the letter of the law, it was illegal. They did it simply because they thought they liked the goods, and they thought that places like Natchitoches in Louisiana were too close to ignore. We can't ignore that there's this big marketplace here. Even though Spanish troops were constantly sent in to disrupt this stuff, a lot of Texans simply said, we don't care. We don't care what the Spanish government does because we are making a ton of money and we're willing to take the chance that, yeah, we're engaging in something illegal. We might actually get caught, but we're willing to take the chance because the money is too good. Now, the reason I mention stuff like this is because the same sort of thing is happening in the British North American colonies. They're trading with people against British regulation, even though the British are sending ships in, they're sending the Navy in, they're sending courts in, creating new court structures. And they're saying, look, you cannot do this. But Americans are going, the profits from the trade is too great a temptation. Even though we know it's illegal, we're not going to stop because the benefit far outweighs any potential problem here. Now, starting in the 1770s, to try to deal with some of this stuff, the king once again started passing new restrictions to try to stop all of this, new restrictions on trade. Now, as the king saw it, the trade, a big part of this would be regulating access to wild herds of cattle, things that would require branding and export restrictions. This is all well and good, okay? And a lot of, to be fair, many quote unquote cowboys, many rancheros, in sort of the grand scheme of things, they were okay with these things. However, and here's the problem with it. Here's the problem with saying we're okay with these things in theory, but in practice, we have a problem. The problem is that the appointed governors who were in charge of enforcing these regulations, almost always they were Spanish appointees, and they were also incredibly overbearing in how they enforced the regulation. The restrictions, especially to access, especially the access to wild herds, had a huge net negative effect on the economy. And this obviously, when the economy starts going down, the rancheros started getting angry about this stuff. The pobladeros pobladores, excuse me, were also trouble here. They had always cared way more about their own individual lives and their economic necessities and things like that. They had developed almost a semi-autonomous relationship with the Spanish government, much like American colonists had done with the British government. Essentially, that we're out of sight, out of mind, so leave us alone, let us do our thing, and we won't cause you problems, you don't cause us problems. Well, now all of a sudden they're seeing new restrictions, and they see these restrictions as an unnecessary intrusion into their daily lives. So the Bourbon reforms in total, as big a deal as they were, the Bourbon reforms really only created, in the long run, really only created one major benefit. Spain recovered, their economy recovered, and there was a somewhat remarkable turnaround at the start of all of this. But it was at the expense of the anger of their colonists. Now, this is kind of where it diverges a little bit with England's history with their New World colonists. England has enormous economic problems, and all of the efforts that they carry out with Americans, with their American colonists, just wind up creating more and more problems. There's never an economic recovery. Here, at least in regard to Spain and their relationship with New Spain, there is an economic recovery. But again, it's at the expense of their colonists' angers. Over the centuries, people in what is going to be Mexico had come to see themselves as more than a colony. And we're going to see this being a big deal, part of a broader effort in a couple of minutes here. But they'd come to see themselves as more than a colony. People in New Spain looked at themselves and said, we're not really Spanish. So they resented these newly appointed administrators coming in, and they resented the reforms. They especially disliked the arrogant attitudes of the Peninsulares. Remember, the Peninsulares are people who are of Spanish descent. These are people born in Spain who have moved to Spain to settle or take administrative positions. So the people, the average everyday person in what will become Mexico, what is at the moment New Spain, the average person disliked the Peninsulares. They believed that the Peninsulares were arrogant. They said, and this is actually accurate, I don't want to make it sound like they're just kind of coming up with this out of nowhere. The Peninsulares absolutely insisted on deference and subservience because of their place in the Casta. However, pobladores just didn't care. They weren't looking to overthrow the king from the start. What they sought was change and more participation. And once again, it's going to be an imperial crisis that leads these people to make independence as their goal. Now, we're going to take a quick detour here and look at what's going on in the rest of the Western world during this same period of time. Because when I talk in my U.S. history classes, I talk about how we always look at American history in some sort of isolation. We act like things happened in the United States that didn't happen or couldn't happen anywhere else, and thus it's unique. It's, somehow American exceptionalism. But it's not. Okay, there's a big process that's going on during this era. And I know I just put up a big list of revolutions here. I don't need you to remember all of these revolutions. That's not the point of this slide. What the point of this slide is that the United States is going to declare their war for independence in 1776. Their triggering moment is a war called the 7 Years' War. It was another global conflict, just like that War of Spanish Succession. It involved Great Britain, it involved France, it involved Spain, it involved Native Americans, it involved Middle Easterners, it involved people in the northern parts of Africa. One big consequence of this, as I mentioned, was that Spain winds up taking control of the Louisiana Territory in 1762. This put the Spanish on the doorsteps of the British Empire. Okay. Now, that's as the Spanish saw it, it doubles their size for the Viceroyalty of New Spain. It extends all the way up into present-day Canada, but it also puts them right smack in the middle, or right up against the British, because the British now control everything east of the Mississippi River. So everybody's got a problem here. Britain's got a problem because their control has doubled, just like the Viceroyalty of New Spain has. Colonial administration has to be paid for, which means taxes. Spain expected the Viceroyalty to shoulder some of this burden. This is paralleled in the experience of the American colonists with regard to the British. The British started saying, we're going to put new measures in place, which, this is a Mexican-American history class, so we're not talking about that stuff. But they put new measures in place, which are designed to increase taxes on the American colonists, and the American colonists rebel. They start rebelling, the American colonists do, in 1765. And there's the famous cry that comes out of these, that we're protesting taxation without representation, and all of this. And it sets in motion the American tax protests in 1765, set in motion a chain of events that is not only going to lead to American independence, the US's independence, but it's going to kick off a 50-year period of independence movements and rebellions all across the Western world. So, for example, we're going to see in 1768, there's going to be rioting in Geneva, Switzerland, over the equality of rights for all men. And I've got on here all man. The proper phrase for it would have been all mankind, because the Geneva, Switzerland rebellion is all about universal rights for everybody. Men, women, doesn't matter. In 1773, we're going to see separate peasant riots in Russia and in France. So the very poorest, the most impoverished people in those two societies start rising up. In 1776, we're going to see obviously the American Revolution, but we also see rebellions in the British Empire. We see them in Ireland, and we see rebellion in England. There's looting, there's arsons that are occurring. Underclasses are starting to rise up and demanding equality, but we're also seeing a fight, almost a civil war breaking out in England over, should we let the Americans go their own way, or should we try to keep control? There was a faction among the British elite who were saying, if the Americans want to be independent, let them go off and try, let them fail, and we'll come back and pick up the pieces. Okay, but there were others who were saying, absolutely not, we need to maintain a strong grip on the American colonies. In 1780, we see revolutions in both Holland and in Belgium. In Holland, for certain, connected to the American Revolution. They were one of the creditors that the United States is going to owe a ton of money to. So it's very much connected with American revolutionary thought. In 1789, we're going to see revolution in France, Poland, and in Switzerland. There's going to even be a massive slave rebellion in Saint-Domingue, which will later be christened as Haiti. The reason for this is when the French were promising American military support, the American government military support, they were actually stopping in Saint-Domingue. They were conscripting enslaved people in Saint-Domingue and bringing them northward into places like Virginia and the American South to fight for American independence. So when these people get done fighting, they get gathered back up by the French, get brought back down to Saint-Domingue. And they start talking about all of this freedom and liberty and all of this stuff that they had fought for in the United States, but had not gotten to partake in. So when this French Revolution rolls around in 1789, talking about, quote, liberty and brotherhood for all, the enslaved people in Saint-Domingue, a French colony, they go, well, us too. And the French showed who they were. They said, well, yeah, we mean liberty and brotherhood for all, but not for you guys. That's not who we meant. So it causes a problem. And these people wind up declaring independence. They overthrow slavery and create an independent nation called Haiti. In 1796, we're going to see a revolution in Italy. And then in 1810, officially, we're going to see a revolution develop in Mexico, as well as all across Spain's New World possessions. So the rioting that happened in 1765 touched off something. It wasn't incidental. It wasn't unique to American history. It's happening all over the place. So given that I'm telling you that they're connected, how are they actually connected? The revolutions are connected by ideas. It's in the realm of ideas that all of these revolutions are connected. Now, our society today frequently takes money and power seriously, but not really ideas, not ideologies. We take ideas seriously if it's an idea that can create lots and lots of revenue streams. But we don't just take ideology and ideas about philosophy and things like that. We don't take those terribly seriously. But ideas do really have power, and they're often the strongest thing around if they actually resonate with lots of people. And that's exactly what happens in the late 1700s and early 1800s. There are ideas that are connecting all of these revolutions. So having set it up like that, I know you're all dying to know what the ideas are. So what are the ideas? The ideas are very simply nationalism. First idea is nationalism. The idea of nationalism is connected to sovereignty here during this era, but it's basically that people should self-govern. They should have their own nation, not be ruled by a faraway empire. So people in the American colonies, people in Ireland, they felt that they should be in charge of their own destiny as opposed to the British government. People in Brazil, people in Argentina, and yes, in present-day Mexico, believed that they should be in charge of their own destiny, not not Spain. Very strongly connected with this idea of nationalism is the idea of sovereignty of the people. The people themselves make the decision about what the future is, what the future will hold. What does independence look like? For the Americans, it meant separating from the British. It did not, incidentally, mean democracy, because the United States declares independence, but they don't declare, quote unquote, a democracy. And literally 3 years into its existence, the United States actually asks one of the princes of Prussia to assume the title King of the United States of America. So they're declaring independence, but what independence means is up to them, not the British. Okay. Same with people in Mexico, in present-day Mexico. The people will make the decision about what the future actually holds. We're not going to be told what it holds. We're going to make those decisions. And then freedom of religion and free enterprise. This is where that secularization stuff comes in for Mexico. This movement away from the mission system, this ability to make our own laws about ranching, about access to the herds, about what we do from an agricultural standpoint. This is all up to us. We decide these things, not Spain, all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. All across the Western world during this 50-year period from 1765 to about 1815, all across the Western world, people are embracing these ideas and using them to mobilize for independence, for liberty, for freedom. Now, in many places, they are these revolutions are violently repressed. They are put down and put down brutally. But in the United States, in France, in Haiti, as I mentioned, and in Mexico, the people win. Now, a key moment in all of that is in France in 1789, when the people of France overthrow Louis XVI. This is why Louis XVI was on my mind earlier, I guess. When the people of France overthrow Louis XVI in their revolution, the revolution becomes incredibly radical. And in 1792, conservative elements sought to rein in the radicalism. They said, okay, it's one thing to be free of Louis XVI. It's another thing for us to be changing everything about our society. So they want to rein in the radicalism and try to restore the monarchy to France. Now, Napoleon Bonaparte is going to emerge as an important military leader within this new structure. This is why Napoleon is such an important figure, not just for France, but globally speaking, he's an important figure. Within the new structure in France, because they can't actually restore the crown, in 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte is going to be appointed as a consul, one of the three leaders of a new French authority. And because of his popularity, in 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte is going to seize power and name himself the Emperor of France. Now, this is my own mistake here. I don't actually have a photograph or a picture of any of the various images associated with Napoleon on the screen here. But I do want to mention that Napoleon, when he seized power in 1804, he had lots of ideas about recreating a new world empire for France. So one of the things that he does ultimately when he's one of the consuls in France is he actually retook the Louisiana territory from Spain in 1800. So Spain loses Louisiana. They lose that critical access and critical control of the Mississippi River. But Napoleon's plans ultimately fell apart for what he was trying to do. And in 1803, he actually sold the entirety of the Louisiana territory to the United States. President Thomas Jefferson of the United States was well aware of the Spanish occupation of Louisiana. He was well aware of Spanish interest in Louisiana. When Napoleon seized Louisiana, because of Jefferson's understanding of what Louisiana was, Jefferson believed that the purchase of Louisiana also included Texas. So this is going to set the United States at odds with Spain, and then ultimately at odds with Mexico as the successor state to Spain over the issue of Texas. So believe it or not, Texas is a problem, quote unquote, for Mexico right from the beginning. Okay. Now, in 1808, Napoleon probably inadvertently, and I'm giving him probably some undue credit in saying probably inadvertently, but he's going to be the one who's going to set in motion the Mexican independence movement by invading Spain and deposing Ferdinand VII as the ruler of Spain. Now, Ferdinand VII had ascended to the Spanish throne by virtue of his connection to Carlos III. So lineage is not an issue. There's no problem about, well, should Ferdinand be in charge or anything like that. He's got the power through, at least according to Spain's laws and the like. He's got power legitimately. But the reason Napoleon is going to overthrow Ferdinand VII is because even though Spain had ceded control of Louisiana back to Napoleon and France, Napoleon did not like that Spain had allied itself kind of sort of with England in trying to put down Napoleon's reign as emperor of France. So one of the things he does, he invades Spain, he deposes Ferdinand VII, and he's going to try to take over control of New Spain. Napoleon is. And here's how he does it. It's in the worst way possible. Napoleon installs as the new ruler, he installs his brother Joseph as the monarch in Spain. This is Joseph pictured at the top of the screen here. He's Napoleon's brother. He's now in charge in Spain. And the people in the viceroyalty, the people in New Spain are now, they don't know what to do. They're unclear about what they should do. Do we, quote unquote, support the monarchy? Because after all, the viceroyalty is answerable to the monarchy. But do we support a monarchy that, quote, we don't want? Or should the viceroyalty of New Spain simply act independently? And the two sides, the two factions in all of this, not surprisingly, are going to be the Peninsulares and the Criollos. Remember, Peninsulares are Spanish-born and live in the New World. The Criollos are of Spanish descent, meaning that their parents are Spanish, so they are by birth, quote, Spanish. However, they're born in the New World. They're born in New Spain, present-day Mexico. Now, the Criollos tended to support independence. They tended to support independence, while the Peninsulares tended to support the crown. Even though, as I mentioned, it's a crown, it's a monarchy, they really don't want, but they just kind of look at it as our support goes to the monarchy. The Criollos see the invasion of Spain, the removal of Ferdinand VII, and the installation of Joseph. They see all of this as the way to get rid of the power of the Peninsulares. At the start of all of this, or at the head of all of this, the viceroy of New Spain is the man pictured at the bottom of the screen, Viceroy Jose de Iturrigari. Okay, his orders from the crown, quote unquote, are to put down any rebellion. Put down rebellion, period, where they come from. He had received orders to put down rebellion from Ferdinand VII. This is Charles IV's son. Now, after Joseph Bonaparte took over, the Criollos in Mexico City put forth a plan to declare a provisional government in New Spain, arguing that Spain was now in the hands of a foreign power, Napoleon's brother. And this, declaring this provisional government, is the only thing that would keep them at bay. Now, a provisional government is exactly what it sounds like. It's a temporary government. It's meant to be temporary. We are the government under these terms, under these provisions. After weeks and weeks of infighting, the Peninsulares finally carried the day, and ultimately they have Jose de Iturrigari arrested and turned over to the Inquisition back home in Spain. He's sent home in chains. He stands trial for treason. Ultimately, strangely enough, he's acquitted. Now, it's likely that Iturrigari did not actually support independence, but rather he was considered guilty of fostering a sense of independence within the criollos. Now, either way, regardless of what he believed or didn't believe, as I mentioned, he's found not guilty, and he's replaced by a new viceroy, Pedro de Garibay. And he's replaced by Garibay under a typical tradition. Garibay is the highest ranking military official. He's the oldest military officer, and thus he gets the appointment as the new viceroy. Now, as we deal with Mexico's independence, let's remember something right off the bat. That is, we are talking about a multi-ethnic, a multiracial movement for independence. When we say Mexico, the people who are fighting for liberation from Spain, this is Indians, it's mestizos, it's mulattoes, it's those Sambos, it's people of African descent, and all groups in between. We're also dealing with various groups of criollos and peninsulares. Also important, this is why I've got the maps on the screen, Mexico doesn't look the way it does today. That, what we think of as Mexico today, doesn't happen until the 1840s. And this is not a perfect border here, but Mexico today is basically right here. Everything below that red line. So that doesn't happen until the 1840s. Basically, when Mexico is fighting for its independence, what is Mexico? Is everything that is the area of New Spain. Everything that is New Spain. The official name of the place that is created by the Mexican Revolution is going to be the United Mexican States, or in Spanish, Estados Unidos Mexicanos. Okay, so to start off, let's deal with the major camps in all of this. Just like in the War for Independence in the United States, the subjects of New Spain are going to launch this war to liberate themselves. The elites, the peninsulares, fight the war to keep the status quo. It's that simple. They will have the Royal Army in New Spain. They are also known as quote-unquote conservatives, if you will, small c conservatives. Also, it's worth pointing out, some criollos will support the conservative movement. That's what conservatism is all about, maintaining the status quo. Okay, not looking forward for new ideas, not looking to progress beyond what the status quo actually is. The revolutionaries are everybody else, including, again, some criollos and all of those other groups that I mentioned. They are going to be the radicals. I'm not going to sit here in my office and tell you that there are literally no peninsulares who supported the revolutionaries or supported the revolutionary movement. But by and large, if you were to find a peninsulare, if we were to travel back in time and find a peninsulare, it would be very difficult to find a peninsulare who supported the revolution. So it's essentially revolutionaries versus conservatives. Revolutionaries, including some criollos, versus conservatives, which is almost exclusively peninsulares and some criollos. The revolutionaries, by and large, this is, I will admit, an atypical revolution in that the revolutionaries are, for the most part, people who are at the bottom levels of society, who are looking to create a change in that social order. Why? The reason I say that is in the United States' revolution, for example, which is kind of looked at as the benchmark revolution of this era, the United States does not result the United States Revolution, excuse me, does not result in a radical transformation of the social order. But that's precisely what the people in the Mexican Revolution actually want. Now, the specific quote unquote official date for the War of Independence, the Mexican War of Independence, is September 16th, 1810. But this war is going to last for a little over a decade. It is one of the largest independence movements in global history. It starts in a small town called Guanajuato. The town is Dolores. Okay, the image that you see on the screen is where you see the star. That's where Dolores is, near present-day Mexico City. And this ultimately is going to spread to every corner of New Spain. It will even become important in Texas. Father Miguel Hidalgo y Castillo is the person who's given credit for starting the movement. He's the father of the Mexican independence movement. Miguel Hidalgo was a criollo, as were most of the priests. Most of the priests were, the priests in New Spain were criollos. It was exceptional. Again, I'm not going to tell you there were none, but it was exceptionally rare for a mestizo or for a Native American to become a priest. So again, almost all of the priests were criollos with a few peninsulares thrown in. But Hidalgo, Miguel Hidalgo, was different than most priests. He got in a lot of trouble with the church. He drank, he womanized, he fathered 3 children, which is very much against Catholic doctrine. He read quote unquote illegal literature. And in general, this is kind of a pain to the Spanish government. He absolutely also cared for the natives and rejected the racial hierarchy. He rejected the casta. He preached what we would today, nobody called it that back then, but he would preach what we would today call liberation theology. He called for equality of the races. He called for equality for women and the like. So Spain wasn't exactly surprised to find Hidalgo behind all of this stuff. Now, it starts, sorry, let me go back one slide for a second. It starts with something called the Grito de Dolores, which was issued in Guanajuato. The wording is unfortunately lost because there was no official transcription taken, and there's no consensus on what Hidalgo actually said. But the spirit of it is this, and I'm quoting from a historian who translated a person who was there, who said this is basically what he said. So when I'm saying this, these are not my words. This is a historian quoting an oral history. What Hidalgo is supposed to have said is, quote, "My children, a new dispensation comes to us this day. Will you receive it? Will you free yourselves? Will you recover the lands stolen 300 years ago from your forefathers by the hated Spaniards? We must act at once. Will you defend your religion and your rights as true patriots? Long live Our Lady of Guadalupe. Death to bad government. Death to the Gachupins," which was a derogatory term, was essentially an ethnic slur against Europeans. So he is calling for something that is way, way more radical than no taxation without representation. Now, I'm not trying to be anti-American here. What I'm trying to suggest to you is that the revolution in Mexico is rooted in real radicalism. Death to bad government. Death to Gachupines. Okay? That is radical. Okay? Now, when the war begins, again, Hidalgo is behind it, and the Spanish are not exactly shocked by this. And he's also going to embrace a very powerful symbol for Mexico that you're familiar with. You've already heard me talk about it, and it's going to be why when I mentioned it all the way back to the, I think, last lecture, I mentioned that she's going to be the patron saint of Mexico, and this is he referred to it in the Grito. It was Our Lady of Guadalupe, or the La Virgen de Guadalupe. The image is on the screen here, the patron saint of Mexico. Now remember, as the people who supported as the Spanish referred to it, the cult of La Virgen, she was the, quote, true mother of Christ, but she's different, okay? Unlike the Virgin Mary, La Virgen de Guadalupe is dark. She's dark-skinned. She speaks Spanish, and she's indigenous, okay? As you should recall, she first appeared to a mestizo named Juan Diego in 1531 at a place that used to be a shrine to the mother goddess of the Aztec, Tonantzin, okay? Hence, La Virgen is not only the mother of Christ, as mestizos see her, she's also a descendant of Tonantzin, okay? So the Spanish rejected La Virgen as blasphemous, but they actually also acknowledge her because they realized she could help with the conversion of mestizos, as I mentioned. If for no other reason, they said, the Spanish priests said, look, if for no other reason, she, quote, looks like them, so she can help us. She will allow us to do our work. So she becomes incredibly popular for a period in the late 16th century, but she becomes even more popular in the 1800s. She's going to allow Mexicans, to claim ownership of what they have. They have taken this religion that was forced on them by the Spanish. It's quite literally, as I talked about before, it's quite literally beaten into them, and they're going to forever alter it, okay? So, if you're thinking, why do people in this circumstance, why would they continue to maintain a connection to Catholicism? La Virgen de Guadalupe is why. Okay? She is the connection to Catholicism. And even today, in the modern United States and in the border region, the border regions, I should say, she's everywhere. La Virgen de Guadalupe is everywhere. This war that these criollos and all of these disaffected people are fighting is about independence. So this is about all forms of independence to these people in this region. La Virgen represents the idea of independence. She's a symbol of freedom. She's a symbol of hope. And during the revolution, Miguel Hidalgo is going to portray her in banners that are going to carry revolutionaries into battle. And the thought of the Mexicanos who are carrying her into battle, their thought is, if God is on our side, who could possibly be against us? So this revolution begins, and it looks for all the world like it's unorganized. For the first 8 or so years of it, the revolution is, according to the Spanish, it's little more than rioting. And to be fair, the revolutionaries had very little discipline. They were untrained. In many cases, they could accurately be described as a sort of ragtag army. And here's the reality of who they are. They were slaves. They were people who were exploited, people at the bottom levels of society. And who they're fighting a very well-trained, professional, powerful army. Now, when I say professional army, I don't mean that these are people who are, well, we take being soldiers very seriously. I mean that that's their occupation. Like, my occupation is I'm a professor, okay? So I'm a professional historian, okay? That's what these soldiers are. These are professional soldiers. That's the job they do, okay? They are not only well-trained, and this is their job, so they take it to varying degrees of seriousness, some more than others, but they're also, for the most part, they are well-fed, they are well-armed, and they have access to medicine, things that the revolutionaries simply don't have. The rebels also, for a lot of this period, do not have the ability to come together. In many cases, they seem to actually fight each other. So they're scattered. And a lot of times the battles are short. these people will fire and run. And this is, again, a commonality in revolutions, especially when you've got these sort of ragtag, armies that are composed on the fly. They know that they can't go out and match tactically what a professional army does. So they'll do things like they will hit and run and they will only engage the army head to head when they've got a very clear, sure chance of victory. But they know that the best they're for the most part, the best they're going to be able to do is fight what's called a defensive war. They're going to have to hope to inflict so many casualties on the enemy that the enemy goes, you know what, this is just not worth it anymore. Okay, so battles are short, they're hit and run. Some last maybe 15 to 20 minutes, but again, they are explosive. They're catastrophic. Hundreds of people die in these fights, and they're occurring in and around Mexico City at first. The battles are almost always, quote, won by the professionals, and the rebels are almost always on the run. Now, the revolt itself begins 2 days after Francisco Javier Venegas takes charge as the new viceroy of Spain. And I've got a bunch of names up here. I've got them just so you see the names that are listed here. Aside from Hidalgo, I'm not necessarily, and Morelos, you're not likely to be tested on specifics of, well, who was Francisco Javier Venegas. But Venegas, again, takes charge as the new viceroy in Spain. He's going to utilize his chief general, Felix Maria Calleja, and they keep the rebels at bay. They keep them outside over and over again, with one exception. They are unable to keep the rebels at bay in Texas, of all places. And here, the reason is the governor of Texas, who is keeping Americans out of Texas by allowing some immigration into the immigration of some craftsmen into Texas. He's allowing this, and he'd also put through a reform to free enslaved people who had been brought into Texas as well. In the north, in Coahuila, Calleja is going to secure the frontier against encroachment from the United States. One of the things that the United States, the State Department, was debating throughout a lot of this was, should we intervene in what's going on in Mexico, or excuse me, in quote, New Spain? Should we intervene in New Spain? And if so, how should we how should we intervene in New Spain? Plus, the governor of Texas, Manuel Antonio Cordera y Bustamante, is going to use Indians to fight off rebels and allow some American colonization as a buffer as well. So the royalist forces in all of this, they're going to capture Miguel Hidalgo very quickly, and it's not going to end well for Hidalgo, for all that I mentioned about him being kind of the guy to start, quote unquote, all of this with the grito. The forces are going to capture him. Hidalgo is going to be tortured. He's going to be beheaded. His head is going to be put on a pike and centered in Mexico City as a warning to the rebels. New Spain truly believed, the viceroy, Venegas, truly believed that this would end the revolution by displaying Hidalgo's head on this pike. They also, incidentally, the royalist forces captured a military leader, a guy named Ignacio Allende, who was a Criollo member of the Spanish military. And he actually favored independence. So when he jumped, it was a huge blow to Spain's army. They captured Ignacio Allende, but this turned out to be a mistake, because once they captured Hidalgo and beheaded him, and they captured Allende and did all of this stuff, the person who took Hidalgo's place, the guy pictured on the screen, is a guy named Jose, another clergy, a Criollo clergy, named Jose Maria Morelos. He is also inexperienced as a militarist, but under his watch, under his watch, the revolutionary movement gained legitimacy because they captured Acapulco. And once they captured Acapulco, they drafted a declaration of sentiments. The revolutionaries did. They drafted a declaration of sentiments, a declaration of independence, a Mexican declaration of independence, if you will, listing their causes, the things that they want out of the revolutionary movement. So they've got all of that. Morelos also gains control of an army of revolutionaries in the north, as Bustamante was showing no fear when it came to recruiting people to fight in Coahuila y Tejas. All of this starts bringing attention to the international community. As I mentioned, the United States is keenly involved in what's going on. The United States did not want to make trouble with Spain. So initially, the United States foreign policy is going to be about neutrality. The United States is going to state, for the record, quote, we are strictly neutral in all of this stuff. But the United States also truly believed that Spain was too weak to do all of this stuff. They believed that we, the United States, was too weak to fight European forces, but they also believed that Spain could not actually maintain control over New Spain. So they wanted the revolutionaries to win. They also, it's worth pointing out here, the U.S. government is also taking their first steps toward an idea called the Monroe Doctrine, which is, for our purposes, the United States is going to declare hegemony over the entirety of North America, over the entirety of the Western Hemisphere. So those who favored the Monroe Doctrine, they look at this and say, even if we don't think we could actually fight Spain at this moment, getting Spain out of the Western Hemisphere is unquestionably a good thing and will help us sew up this idea of maintaining hegemony here. So they're okay with this. Now, the revolutionaries also start drafting a constitution, and the United States agrees to advise in the drafting of this constitution. So since the United States is agreeing to advise in the drafting of the Constitution, it should not surprise you to find out that the Revolutionary Constitution is going to have some strong similarities to the United States' founding documents as well. But the United States is also looking at this from another perspective. They're looking at this not just from the perspective of, from a foreign policy standpoint, getting Spain out of here helps us maintain hegemony, all of this stuff. The United States is and sees itself at that moment as, quote, the great experiment, that we're different because we are, quote unquote, we're a republic. And everywhere else, there's monarchy, there's dictatorship, there's authoritarianism, but we, quote unquote, are a republic. Mexico's independence would reinforce the United States' own independence. In the United States, Estados Unidos and the Estados Unidos de Mexico, these would represent the two biggest rejections of monarchy and two bastions of democracy. And they would be right in the middle of the Western Hemisphere. They take up almost the entirety of the Western Hemisphere. They're right next to each other. So for the US, they look at this and say, we're neutral, but we've got a stake in the outcome of all of this. Now, sadly, to go back here for a second, Morelos is also going to eventually get captured and executed. He will be replaced by the guy on the screen now, Vicente Guerrero. He's going to take charge. Guerrero is a mestizo. He becomes the commander-in-chief of the revolutionary forces, and he does have military experience. He's not, quote unquote, a friar who's leading all of this stuff. He's not, quote unquote, a rabble rouser. He's not, quote, and I hate using this term because it sounds like I'm downplaying these other people. He's not, quote, just a revolutionary. He is actually a soldier. He's got military experience. So with Guerrero coming in and leading the charge, we're finally going to see some semblance of military organization. Guerrero is going to instill discipline within these forces. He's also going to lay out a series of priorities. The soldiers of the Revolutionary Army are going to march as soldiers. They're going to become more soldierly and less like guerrilla fighters. They're going to gain access to weapons that give them a much greater chance. This puts the revolutionaries on a much more equal footing. I'm not going to say equal, but on a much more equal footing. They're much closer. Spain starts to lose ground as the rebels actually start winning some battles because of Guerrero taking charge. Guerrero's ascent is also going to mean something else crucial happening within this war. A number of criollos are going to start switching sides. Once Guerrero is in charge, once he's instilled all of this discipline, once they're winning battles, criollos look at this and say, it's possible. And they start aligning themselves with the revolutionaries. This is crucial because the bulk of the royal forces were made up of criollos. So criollos abandoning the royal forces depletes the power of the royalists. And to be clear about this, it doesn't happen all the time, but sometimes these criollos were switching their loyalties in mid-battle. They're abandoning the royalist side and going to the revolutionary side in the middle of battle. The leader of the movement of criollos out of the royalist side onto the revolutionary side, the leader of that movement is a man named Agustin de Iturbide. He's a criollo. He's a high-ranking official. He had a huge track record of defeating the revolutionaries early on, and of defeating the revolutionaries. But by 1818, Iturbide is on the revolutionary side, and he has joined Guerrero, and he's going up against the last elements of the Peninsulares. Now, there's a last-ditch effort to try to end the revolution in 1812. It is an absolute failure on the part of Spain. The Spanish Cortes created the Constitution of 1812. Now, this Constitution of 1812 was a wide sweeping document that is even considered today to be a forerunner of modern liberalism. So it is, to use the parlance of our times, it is a progressive constitution. It would have, the Constitution of 1812 would have granted citizenship to all Native Americans and ultimately to all of those in New Spain, all of the people in New Spain, meaning all of New Spain. This is the good, if you will. Now, the bad, citizenship was conferred by birth on Peninsulares, which is probably obvious. It's also conferred by birth on criollos and Native Americans. However, mestizos, people of African descent, mulattoes, and all of the other groups within the casta that I talked about, they could gain citizenship through naturalization with one exception. And that one exception is enslaved peoples. And while there would be something similar to the idea of congressional districts, or what we would call congressional districts in New Spain, The only ones with voting rights in these new districts, even though all of these other groups of people could be citizens or there was a pathway to citizenship, the only people with voting rights would be peninsulares and criollos. Now, for many, this whole document obviously is unsatisfactory. They look at it and say, yeah, there's good, but there's a whole lot of bad here. So because of all of that bad and the bad wildly outweighing the good, we can't support this. We're not behind this. Criollos, oddly enough, generally supported it, but peninsulares, oddly enough, hated this. Peninsulares opposed it because they favored absolute rule. They said, we want only the status quo. And if we can't have the status quo, then we'll fight. We're willing to fight. The point became moot in 1814. In 1814, Napoleon was toppled. Spain was once again under the control of Ferdinand VII. And Ferdinand VII was the traditional monarch. And Ferdinand VII clearly opposed limits on his power. Once he came back, he said, I'm the emperor, I'm the king, I'm in charge, no limits on my power. So, in a very real way, he says, now that I'm back in charge, Constitution of 1812, gone, it's out. Ferdinand then did something worse. Now, it's hard to imagine worse than literally tearing up the Constitution that the Cortes had created and said, this is the future. In 1820, Ferdinand VII decided once and for all, the revolution is over. He says, no, it's over. The revolution is over. He decided he was going to send the entire royal army to Mexico to bring the rebels under control and to restore Spanish control of all of the Spanish colonial possessions. Now, Ferdinand had spent 6 years as an incredibly brutal monarch. In 1814 is when he's restored to power. And between 1814 and 1820, he is incredibly brutal in restoring his authority. So when he tells the Spanish military, the royal army, oh, by the way, you're going all the way across the Atlantic and you're going to fight people who have been rebelling against me. For much of the Spanish army, it was over for them. They revolted, they mutinied, and refused to go to the, quote, New World. This developed into an all-out revolt in Spain. Now, this was not helped, to tie this again to American history, this was not helped by the perception that Ferdinand VII had basically sold out part of New Spain for his own benefit by quite literally selling Florida to the United States for $20 million. $20 million in 1820 currency. Okay. So he had done this pretty much to enrich himself, and people in Spain were just aghast at this idea. So they are angry, and they said, and people in Spain, people in the United States, in the State Department, were saying after this treaty is signed that gives the United States control of Florida, they were convinced Spain is not going to be under Ferdinand's rule even for another 6 months. And they were right. Once the military rebelled, it developed into a general revolution in Spain. To maintain power, Ferdinand decided, okay, I'll restore the Constitution. It was a little bit too late for that. In 1823, France moved in to Spain because they said, we cannot allow a monarchy to be overthrown. So they arrested the constitutionalists and once again propped up Ferdinand. Now, with all of this happening, and with all of the criollos abandoning the royalists, the revolutionaries made very quick work of the royalists and made it to New Spain. The Spanish appointed a final viceroy, a last viceroy of New Spain, a guy named Juan O'Donoghue, who is sent nominally, quote unquote, to restore order, but he is also empowered specifically to turn over Mexico to the rebels, to the Spanish rebels, to the Mexican rebels. He does this. As all of this is happening, as all of this stuff is going on in the background, the rebels in 1821 laid out something that they referred to as the Plan de Iguala, the Plan de Iguala of 1821. It is the blueprint for an independent Mexico. Now, the blueprint, the Plan de Iguala, laid out a number of things. First, it recognized the Catholic Church as the official church of Mexico. And it also demanded that a new government must recognize universal racial equality. So this is unique. Mexico has a statement of universal racial equality. Now, understand, this is 1821 that they're putting out the Plan de Iguala. Mexico has some slavery in it, a holdover from the Spanish Empire, but it is not going to be part of Mexico for long. Mexico is going to get rid of slavery in very short order, courtesy of the Plan de Iguala. The Plan de Iguala puts slavery on the path to destruction. Now, New Spain, under this Plan de Iguala, New Spain is declared as a separate empire. And oddly enough, the crown is offered to Ferdinand. They know he can't take it. They know he's not going to take it. Mexico officially declared independence from New Spain literally the next day on the basis of the Plan de Iguala. Spain still had possessions in Central America and in South America, but Mexico is now no longer a part of New Spain. For what it's worth, Spain does not recognize Mexico as an independent nation. They don't say, yeah, fine, whatever, what will be, will be. Spain does not actually recognize Mexico's independence officially until 1836. Let's also remember, too, here, that Mexico is a democratic nation, and it is the largest democracy in the Western Hemisphere. The United States is their neighbor, and the United States might have had a slight territorial advantage, maybe a slight territorial advantage, but the United States certainly did not control all of the territory that it said this is American territory. For example, there were large parts of the Louisiana territory that the United States, while they owned that territory, they certainly didn't control it. Native Americans controlled that. And it's also, I think, should be mentioned here, that the United States is not nearly as democratic as Mexico is. In short order, after all of this stuff, in short order, after the Independence War is over, Iturbide begins maneuvering and has himself appointed as the presidency of to the title Presidency of the Regency of Mexico. And within the year, he also declares himself. You can see on this picture here. This is the territory now. This is the Empire of New Spain, or quote Mexico. Within a year, Iturbide declares himself to be the Emperor of Mexico and assumes a new name, Augustine I. Iturbide had used all of his connections to consolidate power, as well as control the military, and essentially he executed all of those who opposed him and jailed those who he decided not to execute. One of those who opposed Iturbide was a, quote, man of destiny as historians call them. And I forgot to mention the Treaty of Cordoba, which officially ended all of this nonsense with Spain, with the Spanish government being in control. Even though Spain doesn't officially recognize Mexico's independence, they do sign this treaty that gets all of the Spanish authorities out. One of the enemies here was a guy named Juan Antonio Lopez y Santa Anna. Juan Antonio Lopez y Santa Anna, pictured on the screen, was one of those who opposed, he initially was an ally of Iturbide, and he had been given control of Veracruz as a reward for his service in the Revolutionary War for Mexico. However, shortly after Iturbide took the throne as Augustine I, he developed a distrust of Santa Anna, and Santa Anna, for his part, opposed Iturbide's ascension as a quote-unquote emperor. He thought this is not in keeping with what we had just fought for. So throughout 1822 and 1823, Santa Anna raised an army to force Augustine off the throne. Santa Anna wanted, as his plan called for, he wanted free trade. He was considered to be a minor part of a developing revolution against Iturbide, or Augustine I. But others, especially Vicente Guerrero, who we mentioned a few minutes ago as being really important in turning the tide of the revolution, Guerrero actually joins with Santa Anna against Iturbide. This allowed Santa Anna to march from Veracruz to San Luis Potosi and declare himself to be, quote, the protector of San Luis Potosi. And then as part of this, he forced Augustine Iturbide to resign the throne, to resign as emperor of Mexico. Now, all of that is all well and good. This is setting us up to deal with what happens with Texas. But before this actually happens, though, Santa Anna and several others signed something called the Plan de Casamata of 1823. This Plan de Casamata of 1823 very simply would call for a constituent assembly to replace Iturbide. So no more emperor. We're going to have a constituent assembly that also has a statement that those who pledged to the plan would not recognize, quote, the first Mexican empire. This completely isolated Iturbide, Augustine I. Once the plan made it to all of the states, including Coahuila y Tejas, and Iturbide was gone, he's exiled to Italy. The Constituent Congress named a three-man team to exercise executive authority as a sort of provisional authority. Now, this is one of those weird things where there's a sort of confluence, if you will, with Roman history here. The Roman Republic kind of ends with a three-man triumvirate, and here we've got the Mexican Empire ending with a three-man triumvirate, three people in charge. The three people charged with leading the new government, the authority, is Guadalupe Victoria, pictured on the far left, Nicolas Bravo in the center, and Pedro Celestino Negrete, and they moved very quickly in consolidating their power. They redesignated the provinces of Mexico, as they were called, into states. They rescinded formally the coronation of Iturbide. So they said, that coronation, we don't recognize it, didn't happen, he's not in charge anymore. And they also put down insurrections of people who favored Iturbide and favored this empire of Mexico. They put down insurrections in Oaxaca, in Zacatecas, in Yucatan, and Jalisco, as all of these places said no thanks to a Mexican republic. In January of 1831, we've got a new Congress in Mexico again, passing something called the Constitutive Act of the Federation. And by October, they'd finally written the new, quote, Federal Constitution of the United Mexican States. So finally, after all of this stuff, we finally got the Estados Unidos de Mexico. On October 2nd, 1824, Guadalupe Victoria won election as the president and served a 4-year term beginning in 1825. Now, why I mentioned this, Guadalupe Victoria, pictured on the screen here, is the only Mexican president who will serve a full term in office for the next 30 years. He's got a term beginning in 1825, a 4-year term that lasts until 1829. He's going to be the only president for the next 30 years to serve a full term. As even though Mexico wins its independence, its future is, unfortunately, as we're going to see, its future is chaos. And we'll see that chaos in the next lecture.